so good morning, and we have reached, time flew, the final lecture of Stat 331 this term. And so I have here on the board our agenda for today. So it's pretty laid back. So first I just want to give you a few tips about the project, and I'll also answer any questions you have about the project. So we'll do that first. And then I want to do a little rabbit trail into showing you how we can make pictures using residual plots, and then do another demo on that. And then we'll end off the term with a special performance. And in the meantime, Mr. Goose over there says hello as well. Okay, so project. So hopefully many of you have read the description or have already started playing around with some of the data. So that's actually the first thing I want to point out about working with the project data set is take some time to explore the data. Okay, so if you've opened the set, you'll notice that there's a lot of variables. Okay, there's almost 700 predictors that I gave you in the data set. So get a sense of what the data structure is. Make some summaries and maybe make some plots, so you get an idea of what you're working with. So that's always an important part of the analysis, to get a sense of your data before fitting models. And so, okay, a little segue about the data. So it's about protein folding, and in particular about a specific protein that's people have been studying this year because of the COVID virus. Okay, so this is very relevant to the data that people who have been trying to develop therapeutics and treatments, is to understand this particular protein structure. So one of the reasons why the virus is able to be quite infectious is because of its spike protein, which allows it to latch onto the human cells via the ACE2. Okay, so this is some real-world data, and this project is meant to help mimic real-world prediction. Okay, so I want you to use this opportunity to build some experience working with real data sets, and especially since we live in this time of so-called hype over data science. So this will give you a chance to hone your skills. Okay, so that's the purpose of the project. Okay, so with that said, I also want to mention that there isn't just one right way to build the model. So that's my second tip. No one right model. And what I mean by that is there's I expect there to be quite a number of reasonable ways to build a predictive model for the benchmark data that you have in the data set in terms of predicting the accuracy. I expect that to be the case because there's so many variables, and no one can do an exhaustive search. And so the idea is to do the best we can to use the training data and build a predictive model. And so to make this sort of like a realistic prediction challenge, that's why I'm going to assess you on a test set where. So how I created the data sets, as I mentioned in the description, is I simply took a large set of data and I randomly divided it into two halves. Okay, so that's how you know that if you have a good working model on your training data, and you do appropriate validation and that sort of stuff, then a byproduct of that is that it should do pretty well on the test data. Okay, so this is a nice real experience for you to practice your skills in this sort of data science application. Okay, and so while we're on this on this note, especially the lectures from last week where we talked about cross-validation and predictive performance. So even though I'm not showing you the response variables in the test set, you have the tools in order to get a pretty good idea of how well you're going to do. So that's where the methods about, especially combining cross-validation with model selection, can help you. Okay, so so the key here is, in your report, you will have to explain to us what model you're fitting and why. Okay, and of course, along the way, you're free to play with several different approaches, and ultimately, if you settle on one approach, that's the main one you'll be writing up, of course, and that's where you explain to us and convince us why your approach is appropriate. Okay, and so so make sure you understand. So this is my third tip: is understand what you're fitting and why you chose your approach. Okay, so you need to convince yourself and then write it in your report and convince us that the methods you selected are appropriate. Okay, so understand what you're fitting and why. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of tools in this course, and so that one of the goals of the project is to help you remember what we've studied and to put them together in a coherent way. So now you're in charge of the analysis. Okay, so you can use anything we've talked about, or you can even, if you're curious, you can even look up other extensions of that. And you want to link all those tools together and now do and prepare a model and a report that reflects your understanding of how to use these tools well. Okay, so that's the third point. And the fourth point is about how you present it. So so presentation is important, and so that's why you're asked to write a report. And so just few tips for presentation. So in particular, we don't want to see, so please do not put any raw output directly in your report. There's an appendix for you to put code, so please in your report. Okay, so just by looking at the report, I should not see it should not require specialized training in R for me to read your report. So pretend that you're writing for an intelligent non-expert, okay, so then you can explain what you did and why you did it and why you expect it to be a reasonable way to tackle the problem. Okay, so of course you probably be using R and you'll be generating on R output. So if you're making figures, only put the figures in the report. Okay, there's code in the appendix. And if you're making tables, make sure you make nicely formatted tables in the report. Okay, so treat it as if you're writing a paper. Okay, so it should be understandable to someone who doesn't necessarily know R, but does have some understanding of statistics and of regression methods. Okay, so make sure you write everything in complete sentences and properly explain what you're doing. So that's very important. So that's another skill we want you to develop and have some practice doing that and get some feedback on it from us. Okay, and so those are four points, and okay, and then the obvious thing is don't wait till the last minute. Okay, so this data set, just to remind you, the data set has many variables. Okay, so don't run yourself into an issue where you need to come with a model and your code might take a couple hours to run. So don't get yourself into that situation. So don't wait until last minute. So one recommendation is at least get a working model. Okay, so at least you know you can generate predictions. And remember, we want you to generate predictions as a list of values. And I'm going to set up a web form where you can submit your predictions. And so you're gonna generate a file that has one value per line, one for each observation in the test set, and then you're going to submit that to us for assessments. Okay, so make sure you at least have a working model. You can refine it over time as you learn patterns in the data and maybe try different algorithms, and make sure you at least have something that can generate predictions. Okay, so if you come up with a baseline model, then you can see how some of the methods we've talked about can help you improve that. Okay, so one tip here, because the data has many variables, make sure you watch out that you don't overfit. Okay, so be careful about overfitting. Okay, so make sure you use appropriate methods to ensure that you're not going to have. So remember what overfitting means. It's where you have really good performance on your training data, but that performance doesn't translate over to your test data because you've overfitted in the sense that you're modeling. You've put in for example, too many variables such that you're now modeling some of the noise, and you're picking up signal where there isn't signal. Okay, so that's something to be careful of because you're given so many predictors. Okay, so be careful about overfitting. Okay, so in terms of evaluation, remember that there's two components. The report is worth the bulk of your grade, 75%. Okay, so that's where we're putting most of the emphasis. So you want to, so the grading emphasis is on the how and why. So how did you come with the model, and why did you make the choices you made? And some of that will, of course, be justified by some of your results that you're going to show from what you conclude based on the data available to you for fitting the predictive model. So you want to tell us why it's useful, why the model you fitted is useful for prediction. And generally, if that's pretty convincing, then you shouldn't be too worried about like how well it will do, because you already have a good estimate of how well your model will do. Okay, and so the other component, which is 25%, is based on your actual predictive performance. Okay, so those are my comments about the project. So that you find it a good experience to work with real data where no one knows the ideal or the one correct answer to it. And so yeah, use this opportunity to increase your experience with data science. So with that, I'm going to see if there's any questions about the project. So you can type them in chat, and then I will answer them. This data set is something that I'm pretty interested in myself, as part of my research is to one of my research areas is studying how proteins fold using computational algorithms, and so that's why the data is generated from a protein folding algorithm. So the idea of generating a 3D structures for proteins based on the amino acid sequence. So it's a pretty large research area, especially in computational biology and in bioinformatics. So it's one of these like open problems where we're still looking for a general answer to how proteins fold, and that's been ongoing for more than 50 years now, since computers were invented. So this is just give you a little foray into this research area, and hopefully you can pick up some skills and also learn some patterns about how protein folding works, in just using this data set as a little glimpse into this research area. Okay, so questions. Can we use bullet points? Okay, so if you If you are, for example, you're listing like the steps of an algorithm, feel free to type that as a list. Or if you have a few summary points that you want to use, then you can definitely type that in bullet form. In general, for most of the report, you should be writing in paragraphs and writing it in paper form. But for some instances like that, like if you're writing down your algorithm or you want to summarize a few key points, you're definitely allowed to use an enumerated list or a set of bullet points. Okay, do you have any other questions about the project or anything else in the course? I will. So please let me know in chat. And in the meantime, let me clear the board so I can tell you a little bit about how to hide pictures in residual plots, which I did before with the pumpkin in one of the demos. Okay, so there's a question: if we are generating this in R Markdown, since we don't want to show code in the actual thing, we display graphs. Yeah, so you're definitely welcome to use R Markdown. Just make sure when it's knit that we don't see any raw R output, right? So if your R Markdown is generating a graph, you should only see the graph in the report. And so you can. So R Markdown or some sort of LaTeX is very helpful in terms of helping make sure the report looks nice and it's and formatted well. Although of course you're not obligated to use a LaTeX-based typesetter. So yeah, you can fiddle with the R Markdown option so that you don't show R code in the actual thing. Okay, so if you have any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them along the way. And also, we will still be reading Piazza, so you can also put your questions as you work on the project there. Okay, so second point is pictures and residual plots. So this was actually based on a paper published in the American Statistician in I think 2007. Okay, and the title of the paper is Residual Surrealism, so kind of cute title. And the idea was that you can use, in theory, residual plots to make pictures of things. Okay, so well, what is a residual plot? So this is kind of a nice way to wrap up some and tie together some of the things that we've learned in the course. Okay, so what is this plot? Well, we want the pairs of fitted values and the residuals. Okay, so these are the pairs. So mu I hat, that's the fitted value for the ith observation. Okay, so this is the plot we're making. It's fitted values versus residuals. Okay, so I is 1 to n. So we want these points to be, so basically we're using residual plots to draw, let's say, an arbitrary black and white image. Okay, so then the points would represent the black pixels in the image, and then where you don't have points, that would be the white in the image. Okay, so want these points to represent the black pixels of the image, locations, pixel locations in the image. Okay, and so in order to do that, well, first we need to convert an image into black and white. Okay, so you look at Mr. Goose over here. You know, there are parts that are very black, and then there's some grayish parts. So to mimic that, you know, we would use to mimic a more gray background. We would use more scattered pixels. So that's one way of approximating grayscale using just using just black and white. Okay, so this is sort of like, this is kind of neat because it's like a reverse engineering problem, right? So in general, in regression, we give you y and we give you the predictors and we say, okay, what, fit the model and then check your assumptions, right? But now it's like, okay, we know where we want black pixels to be, and now let's reverse engineer and try to get a set of y's and a set of x's that will give us the residuals that we want. Okay, so so remember in the usual case, so recall when we fit regression in fitting a linear regression, that the residuals, so the residual vector and the vector of fitted values satisfy a couple equations. Okay, so this is where things we've learned actually tie together nicely. Okay, so we know that the fitted values can be expressed as a hat matrix times the vector of responses. And we also know that the vector of residuals can be expressed as identity minus the hat matrix times the vector of responses. Okay, so that's something we learned. And so remember, this is if you have n observations. Okay, so if n is your number of observations, then basically you have here a system of so how many equations are there? Remember, so this is you can think of this as a linear system, which is a linear system of equations. Okay, so how many things are in there? Well, the mu hat vector has n fitted values, and then there's also n fitted value, n residuals in the E vector. So this is a system of equations with 2n system of, I should just say system of 2n, linear system of 2n equations. Okay, and so now instead of using the model and calculating mu hat and E, we now plug in the mu hat and E that we want, and then we now have to choose an appropriate hat matrix and appropriate response that satisfies these equations. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So we want to reverse engineer Okay, so we need a y and some predictor vectors, so x1 up to xp could be. Okay, so there isn't going to be necessarily one unique solution, and I'll explain that in just a moment. So what could these predictors be, such that after you fit the regression model, you get the mu hat and the E that we want? What they could be. Now notice in these things here. Well, how many variables are here? Well, you're going to have each of these is a vector with n observations. Okay, so we can choose n possible response values, and the same for each predictor. Okay, so for example, if we have more predictors, that actually gives us more degrees of freedom to satisfy these equations. So in general, if I write it this way, if you have p predictors, then essentially you have n times. So how many things are here? Well, there's p predictors plus the response, so n times p plus 1 free variables. Okay, which if you compare, okay, so as long as p is, you at least have a few, for example, use 2 or 3 predictors, so you have 3 predictors, then you have 4n free variables, and you can satisfy 2n equations. Okay, so that's why this is doable, right? Because you can, if it doesn't work very well, you can add another variable, and you can always increase the amount of flexibility we have to solve possible h and y to satisfy these equations. So usually what we do then is, I mean, we haven't even talked about the regression coefficients. So in the paper, because of this flexibility, we can simply just fix beta. Okay, so we can choose our regression coefficients. Choose our regression coefficients. Okay, so there's enough flexibility that we can specify the beta we want. In fact, we can even specify what R square we want to come out of the regression, because we can always use this flexibility to satisfy those criteria. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Now let's do show you a little bit more detail, and then before doing another demo with you. Okay, so we have these two equations, and so for the sake of generating, so now we need an algorithm to actually generate h and to generate y. So remember, h is the hat matrix. It's computed as a function of the x matrix with the predictors. Okay, so remember that. So again, recall in our multiple linear regression that we're modeling y as x beta plus epsilon. And so it turns out it's easier to conceptualize in terms of writing writing in terms of epsilon, and then generating y given epsilon. Okay, so this is it's sort of a strange concept, given that we've always treated epsilon as this nebulous noise variable. But now, since we're reverse engineering, we can plug in noise. Okay, so we can randomly generate some noise and then use that noise to solve these equations. Okay. All right. So so these two equations. So the two equations can be expressed as, okay, so I'm going to substitute, okay, so mu hat, so I'm going to substitute what y is, okay, so it's going to be the hat matrix times x beta plus epsilon. Okay, so what is the hat matrix? So H is x transpose x inverse x transpose. Okay, so hat matrix times x beta. So again, notice here beta is already pre-specified, so we plug in whatever regression coefficient we want. Okay, so we notice that h x beta, that cancels out when the x transpose x is, so this is just going to be x beta plus h times epsilon. Okay, so that takes care of the first equation. And the second equation can be expressed in a similar way. So we do, again, actually the second equation we already have shown in one of our previous lectures that I can also write equivalently. Okay, so remember we saw this, that the residuals can be written as I minus h times epsilon. Okay, so remember that I pointed out at that time that this doesn't imply that epsilon and y are equal. Okay, and the reason is because I minus h is not invertible. Okay, so we've seen this alternative way of expressing the vector of residuals. Okay, so those are my equations now in this form. And likewise, I can write this as, so if I multiply through, so I have epsilon minus h epsilon. Okay, so these are the equations. Now, one thing we also learned is that also recall that we need residuals also satisfy the condition. Okay, so this is actually nice because it ties together so many things that we learned in this course. Residuals satisfy the condition that if I take mu hat transpose and I multiply that by the vector of residuals, this has to be 0. Okay, and we learned this because we know that since the residuals are orthogonal to the span of x. Okay, and so because they're orthogonal, therefore remember mu hat this fitted value lies in the span of x. So therefore, those are also the residuals are also orthogonal to the fitted values. Okay, so we need the residuals to satisfy this condition. Okay, and in this case, it's a little tricky because this is not necessarily guaranteed by an arbitrary picture. Because now the picture we want to encode in the plot depends on these two quantities, but then we have no guarantee that this condition is satisfied. Okay, which might not be satisfied by an arbitrary image. Okay, and so if it's not satisfied, then the solution actually involves, recommended in the paper, actually involves another concept we've learned in this class. Okay, so if it's not orthogonal, well, let's add. So the solution is let's add some points. So in other words, add a few pixels. Okay, so how can we really change add a few points to help satisfy this equation? So what points are actually going to have the largest effect on mu hat and on the residuals? Well, as we learned about influential observations, okay, so we start putting in some high leverage points, putting in some outliers. So in other words, if we add some points to the corners of the image, so we just add a few pixels to the corner of the image, that can help stabilize this condition. Okay, so I don't know if you noticed in the last picture, when I did the pumpkin, it added a little bit of noise in the corners of the images. So you'll see a few extra pixels, and what that actually does is it helps enforce this orthogonality condition. Okay, so add a few pixels to the corners. So these are sort of like outliers, high leverage points, influential points. Okay, so that to satisfy the condition. Orthogonality. Okay, so that's kind of a neat application of influential points. Actually helps stabilize the image so that you can get orthogonality, which is required in order to calculate least squares solutions. Okay. All right, so now I want to finish off by explaining a little bit about how to actually compute these. Okay, so actually, a lot of fun things that you can do with regression require quite a lot of linear algebra. Okay, so if you're curious, I will add the paper where I'm drawing this from to learn if you want to take a look. But the linear algebra does get quite hairy, so I'm just going to give you a brief summary of that. Okay, so let's. So that's talking about the orthogonality. Okay, so I need space here. Okay, so all right. So remember the least squares solution. Okay, so that reminds us of the geometric interpretation of least squares. Least square solution, implies that the one vector times the residual is 0, and likewise the same thing for each predictor. Okay, so if I'm going to call this x tilde transpose will equal 0. So this is for the intercept, and this one is for the predictors. So again, so x is going to be the vector 1s, and then with x like this. Okay, so it's a block matrix. This is what I'm saying. So this is the part of x dropping the vector of 1s for the intercept. So least squares solution satisfies these two things. Okay, so this gives us a hint about like what we can do with to satisfy these equations. So in particular, I can set up a form for x tilde transpose. Okay, so if we let this part, so x tilde, to be expressed in this form. So I'm going to express it in terms of something we know, so the identity, and then I'm going to subtract by construction. This is what we know because we have the residuals from the image we want to compute. So we set up a matrix that looks like this, and we put E transpose E on the bottom, and then multiply this by some arbitrary matrix. So they call it M. So this M matrix will be n by p. Okay, then this satisfies this construction. Okay, so x tilde times epsilon equals 0 is satisfied. Okay, and that helps. And the reason, well, and then you can see because you take the transpose of it, so the m goes on the left side, and then this part times the epsilon equals times the residual equals 0 by construction. Okay, you'll see E transpose E is going to, one of them is going to cancel, then you're going to have E minus E, so you get a 0 vector, distributed vector. Okay, so for any matrix M, for any M matrix. Okay, so now we realize then that we can write x tilde in terms of this arbitrary M matrix, and so everything else we've written here, for example, H is also implicitly going to be a function of M as well, because H involves x, and x has x tilde in it. Okay, so implicitly, H is a complicated function of M. Okay, and then x is simply x tilde with one column of ones next to it. Okay, so the idea is to write these equations now in terms of M, and then use an iterative algorithm to pick an M that satisfies the equations. Okay, so just give you one more step, and then we will leave it at that. And then if you're really curious, you can look at the paper. Okay, so the suggestion then is, well, in order to help fix M, well, let's first generate let's generate some epsilons, and then plug them into the first equation. Okay, so the next step is simulate a vector. Let's call it a Z vector from a normal IID, from a normal mean zero and some variance. Okay, and so this parameter we can actually use to control for the R squared in the multiple linear regression. Okay, so we generate some data, so we can set this to achieve whatever, some target value of r squared. And let epsilon, okay, so this is basically, so it's coming from this second equation. So what we're doing is we're rearranging this, this equation. Okay, so if you see here, epsilon is related to residuals. It's the residual plus something, right? So what we're saying here is, in order to get iterative solution, one way is we generate something from a z, and then you plug it in. So we call this now the residual plus the hat matrix times z. Okay, so we now substitute this thing we simulate, and then we substitute this epsilon, which is in terms of this hat matrix involves the M matrix. So now we plug all this into the first equation. Okay, and substitute substitute it in the first equation. So now we have mu hat is x beta plus h times all of this. Okay, and I can drop one of the h's because the hat matrix is idempotent, and so h squared is h, and then this part is actually 0 because h times the hat matrix times the residual vector, it also simplifies to 0. Okay, and so let's look at what we know here. So by design, we know what we want the fitted values to be. We've made use of the residuals we want in here, so that's now hidden in this construction. Okay, so that's now incorporated in the epsilon I plugged in. Okay, so this thing is a function of m, and then this thing is also a function of m. And so the last step here is this is actually the most complicated part, is developing an iterative solution. So basically you update, so we have an iterative solution to iteratively update m until it satisfies the equation. Okay, and then once we have m, then we can plug it back into this expression to get x. Okay, so now we have x, and then once we have x, we have this. Okay, so now we know what we can now back solve. Okay, so now we can calculate what the epsilons would be, plugging everything in because we know the residuals. Once we have the hat matrix, once we have m. Okay, and then z we simulated. So now we have all the epsilons, and then we can go back and calculate what the y values need to be. So that's an overview of this image generation algorithm. Okay, so it's pretty neat, but it's actually not simple. Okay, and so the paper came with a program that does this. So fortunately I didn't have to code all this myself. So what I'm going to do is let's show you another demo. So I'll run through that program, and then and if you like, you can also download that program and play with other kinds of images. Okay, so I'm going to head over to the computer and then do this, run through this demonstration. Okay, so let's show you how this works. So the program provided by the author, I think only, or at least the easiest version to use, runs on Windows. So I booted up a Windows VirtualBox, so I can show you this here. So here is here's the goose image. Okay, so this is the picture that we will encode. All right, so there's cute Mr. Goose honking about memes. So let's convert this. So there's two steps, right? So first we're going to convert this into a black and white image. Okay, and so there's a script that does this. Image, it's called image to points. And so there's some settings here. So it's sort of a batch script, so I put there's actually not too many things to set. Like there's the image file name, and then there's how much of the image I want to be black. So then it'll basically that will help scale how much point density it'll try to put in to achieve the lighter colors in the picture. And then there's some other settings. So this script converts the image into black and white. And so let's just run that image to points. Okay, I'll show you a preview of it. Should come up. Okay, so this shows various sampling fractions. So basically there's some settings, right? When you convert a color image to black and white. The density, so how much black do you want, controls like how much. It really depends on the picture, right? So in this case, this one on the top left here I think works pretty well. It shows enough color in the beak, so that we know it's not black, but we'll see in its shape, and we can still see the letters fairly well. Okay, so if we're not putting enough black, then in this case. It's much harder to see the picture. Okay, so this is the setting that we will use. Okay, so let's close that. So we'll finish generating the files for that. Okay, so now we have a black and white image where the black pixels are the locations of the where we want the residuals to be on our fitted values and residual plot. So now we have to take that and generate the data set. So the data set involves the response, we need a y variable, and then we need a bunch of predictors. So that's done in this using this script. So that takes the output that was just generated, so the goose file. There's some other options. You could put like hidden messages into the image as well. So this is where you can actually control some things. So I mentioned we can set our own regression coefficients. Okay, so that's considered an input for the algorithm. We can even set like what R squared we want in our generated regression. And then there's some other settings about like how we want the correlation structure to be, and that will help control how random that thing looks. Okay, so if we're not using enough predictors, it's possible that you'll sort of see like a fuzzy goose in one of the pair plots. Okay, so that would be undesirable, because then when someone looks at the pair plot, then we sort of see a picture in here, right? So these are some of the settings to help ensure that the image is actually hidden and doesn't show up. So you don't want the residuals. You don't want the response to be too highly correlated with a particular predictor, because then the residuals would be highly informed by that predictor, and then you'll start to see like a fuzzy goose in the image. All right, so there's other things here, but those are the key inputs to the dataset generation algorithm. So in this case, I'm going to use 3 predictors. So let's run the make the data set. Okay, so this is what I pointed out. So if you put nothing, you do not get orthogonality between the fitted values and residuals. So you notice what happened between the first and the second plot was the algorithm added some noise, right, in the corners of the picture, and that's what helps ensure that that a least squares regression can actually be fitted. So let me just, because that went by pretty fast, so let me just show you again. So here it is without notice. The slope of the regression line is not 0, but we want orthogonality, so the algorithm added these extra points in the corner, so it doesn't really interfere with the display of the image, but there's enough of those points, of these influential points, such that we get orthogonality between the fitted values and the residuals. Okay, so with that done, I can now go to RStudio and load in the picture. I mean the picture as encoded in the data set. Okay, so let's do this. So I'm gonna open this. So let's make this a little bigger. Okay, so let's read table. It should be in the out files. And Goose. Alright, so here's our 4 variables. So they're not labeled here, but the first one is y, and then the other 3 are x1, x2, and x3. So let's just look at the pairs plot first. Okay, so it just took a little bit of time to draw, so looks pretty good. Don't see any fuzzy goose in here, so it's hidden. The picture is hidden pretty well. So that's pretty good. Let's fit the model now. So let's call M. Let's do LM. So first one is Y, and then we have the 3 variables. Data set is X. Okay, so let's just check the fit summary. Yeah, so you notice the inputs into the algorithm are pretty well satisfied. So in the input we said we want the betas to be roughly 1, 3, and -2. So they were quite well fitted in terms of using the inputs we specified. So it's not going to be exact, again, because the algorithm had to add some influential points to make the orthogonality condition work. And then there's also a target value of r squared, which it basically hit right on, about 0.51. Okay, so let's just check that this worked. So we plug the fitted values, and then we plot the residuals. Oops. There we go. And the residuals, and this should work. Okay, so there's Mr. Goose, and so now this is what we mean. Like there's some additional noise along the side, and that allows this whole thing to work. So now we know that the fitted values and the residuals here are indeed orthogonal. Okay, and so let's just zoom in a little bit so we can see it a little more clearly. And so I think it's let's just make it a little bit bigger, just so we can see the words as well. So it's a little, I mean, actually it's clear like this, right? So it's a little bit fuzzy, but we can see the intended output here. Okay, so that's how this works, and so there's a web page for that, and it's over here. So this is the web page where they show a bunch of these things, and you can fiddle around with the computer code, and this is where I got their batch files for this. Okay, so that's a quick demo of that. And so that brings me to the end of that demo. So okay, I don't see any other questions in chat. So the last thing we want to do is so I've played, of course, many piano pieces for you throughout this term. And so what I mean by a special performance is we'll do a duet today. So the piece is called In Autumn. It's a transcription of an orchestral piece by Edward Grieg. Okay, so we'll do a duet version of that on the piano. So hope you enjoy it, especially, and I think it's fitting as we start to see the end of fall, or the end of autumn is now upon us. Okay, so I will head over to the piano for that. So just give us a moment to move everything, and then we'll be right back with you.